Well, good morning. I don't say that very often. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and you're on House Divided, one of the many shows we have on Author's Voice, and hope you will watch some of the others as well. But of course, ours is dedicated to history, Lincoln, the presidency, Civil War, and we're stretching that boundary here and there, but glad you're with us. So, today, we're really honored to have David Garrow here, just your basic overachiever, frankly. Graduated magna cum laude from Wesleyan University, a PhD from Duke. He's now a professor of law and history at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He's a regular contributor to the Washington Post, New York Times, New Republic, many other journals and magazines. His previous books are numbers of them, but they include one that won the Pulitzer, Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And also Liberty and Sexuality, the right to privacy and making of Roe versus Wade. His latest book is this thing right here. The table is strong enough for it, I think. Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. It's a William Morrow book. It's an imprint of HarperCollins. 1,460 pages, including 271 of footnotes. It's $45, and I didn't put here how much. It's going to be a little bit more than our usual for post to you, though. The first time I saw this book, I looked to the future, and someone is going to be asked, is that a birthmark? And they're going to answer, no, it's a bookmark. My mom was reading David Garrow's book and propping it up on my stomach. So that's what's going to happen with this. It's really a wonderful, real tome. And I like it very much because of its comprehensive nature. But let's first start out with what impelled you to this subject. You started in '08.
Yes.
So what was there that you felt that you had to continue with and verify things that were going on in his life and beyond, and why Obama in the first place?
Given how much I've written in my life about race in the U.S., when Barack first emerged as a serious presidential contender in '08, I was embarrassed that I knew virtually nothing about this guy. So I started reading his memoir, started reading the biographical journalism during that whole campaign year. The more of the journalism I read, the more disappointed, the more underwhelmed I became. So by the time...
In what way?
It was unthorough, uncurious. People weren't doing much legwork.
Okay.
The motif of journalists is that if they're going to write about Barack's time at Harvard Law School, for example, they want to interview, one person of color, one conservative, one woman. They're not thinking in terms of the entire population of who was there. By the time of Barack's inauguration in January of 2009, soon after that I made the decision that I'd come here to Chicago and interview at least his mentors during his community organizing years, 1985 to 1988, after college, before law school, his first real serious job. And the very first day here in Chicago, the first of the mentors, whom I went to see, Greg Galuzzo, Greg said to me, "Oh, you should go see Marianne Wilson, the lawyer who incorporated all our community groups." And tax attorneys save their files. So a morning or two later, in Miss Wilson's law office, she brings out this manila folder, from '86, '87, in which there are all these documents typed by Barack back at that time, including a list of 45 or so people who were active in his community group down on the far south side here in Chicago. So voila, 48 hours into this, in terms of seeing people, I've got this list of people to go search for, only like 3 of whom had ever been contacted by journalists.
And
So that
so
was
it
the
was-
beginning of the slippery slope.
Yeah, exactly it. Word of mouth, and then they brought you to 12 others, and off you go.
Yes.
You know, the New York Times, which was critical of this, was it. I agree and disagree. I agree to the extent that did it need an editor? Maybe for the printed edition. We're going to get to this because I found as a book dealer, there's a publishing interest story here. And so I see it as if it was edited down as a more normal print book, it might have wider, maybe not sales, but readership and all the way through. But because it is difficult in a way to handle it. But at the same time, I agreed very much about the comprehensiveness of it. And to me, it's like a compendium. Billy Herndon did this with Lincoln. He went right out after the assassination and saw everyone he could and interviewed them. Wish he had done it earlier, but he got to them who knew at that time, you know, he was going to be the martyr. But it's a compendium for, I think, the future.
Oh, exactly.
And it's interesting reading. If you can get through the whole thing, terrific. If you want to dip in and dip out. But that's what I want to ask you about the publishing aspect of it. Why not have the best of both worlds, perhaps? And I'm wondering what the decision was to make it one large book instead of maybe shortening it for the reading part and then taking much of what you had, either putting it on a dedicated website or in a disc in the back. What was the publishing reasoning behind this?
Sure, absolutely. This was very much my choice to go at this length. And we, when I say we, I mean myself and Andrew Wiley, my literary agent, very well known in the business. And it was our decision to go with HarperCollins rather than 3 other houses because Harper was willing to go this length. Much of the length of this book comes from Barack's 8 years down in Springfield, Illinois, a town familiar to Lincoln scholars.
Yes, yes.
And Barack's time in the state legislature, I think, is a wonderfully rich story, something journalists paid almost no attention to because they don't find the Illinois State Senate terribly dramatic or exciting. But HarperCollins was willing to do this, whereas other houses, in a much more traditionally commercial mindset, wanted to shrink this book by 25 or 30%.
Right.
And I said no. I was also told, I won't name the house, but anyone who's interested could easily find it out, another house, that they had no interest in publishing a 2-volume biography of Barack Obama, that there would not be sufficient interest, even though this house was in the midst of publishing a 3-volume biography of Joseph Stalin. I found that an interesting position to take. But I could not be more pleased, more proud of the physical production value that HarperCollins has done with this.
And there's so much information packed in here, just so much. So that's why I think it more almost as a research tool for the future.
Yeah,
Without this, people would have a lot of problems finding that. Let's ask about...
Let me say 2 things, if I may.
Please.
I mean, my very conscious intent with this book, just as with Bearing the Cross, my King book, as with Liberty and Sexuality, my history of Roe v. Wade, is very much to produce a book of record that will still be the essential starting point 30 years down the road, I mean, which is the case with Bearing the Cross. Yeah. We talked about, and you have a better count than I do, the hundreds of pages of endnotes. I think at some point in the future, endnotes will move to the web. Yeah. But it was very much Andrew Wiley's thinking that we did not want to be the guinea pig to go that route. I had a person in a bookstore just yesterday saying to me that readers of a book like this want the endnotes right there in their hand.
I agree with
so
that.
that they can flip to page 1213.
Yeah, but you can always have your computer right there.
Right.
Let me ask about your sources. They were very wide-ranging, of course. Besides Sheila Yeager, whom we'll get to. Uh, who are the most helpful and important to you? Not only in just finding the slippery slope to others, but they themselves, their recollections. Who are some of those that we normally wouldn't have known of?
First and foremost, Rob Fisher. Rob was Barack's best friend at Harvard Law School, 1988 to 1991, from day one. Rob's white, older than Barack, had taught economics for 6 years before beginning law school, had a PhD in economics from Duke. And Rob and Barack became sort of inseparable intellectual partners. During their time at Harvard, they wrote an unpublished book manuscript, about 240 pages. Half of it's on the economics of plant closings, half of it's on race. It's a tremendously rich resource. And it's worth stressing, too, that throughout the 1980s into the 1990s, Barack Obama was a letter writer. This is a time when people were still writing letters on paper. And when you go interview people in person, folks make the effort to look and search for what do they still have in the basement, the attic, the garage. And so it's a lot of the richness of this huge book comes from these contemporaneous documents written by Barack himself.
To get in some detail, and Jake from South Holland, thank you, Jake, very much for sending in a question. How deeply did Chicago's South Side affect Obama's political views during the 1980s and 90s? Did the stereotype of danger and decay in those neighborhoods hold up to the reality?
Yes, that's a great question. The 3 years Barack is working down in Roseland, West Pullman, Altgeld Gardens, those are transformative years for him. He gets here to Chicago, having grown up in Hawaii, lived a little bit in Indonesia. During his 4 years in college, first at Occidental, then at Columbia, his whole friendship network is international guys, Pakistani, Indian, South Asian. His first serious girlfriend, Genevieve Cook, daughter of an Australian diplomat. So working down on the far South Side is Barack's first immersion in an African-American world. Harold Washington is mayor of Chicago at that time. Very inspirational figure. Dies very suddenly, tragically, November of '87. But the combination of how difficult building up a community group proved to be, and the contrast with Washington's persona and presence on the political scene, Barack pretty quickly, year and a half, 2 years down there, makes the decision that he's going to follow the Harold Washington path and go into electoral politics.
Did he meet? Did they meet?
Only passingly. Mayor Washington goes to a community event down in Roseland, just off South Michigan Avenue. Barack is in the back of the room. One of the motifs of community organizers is you always put your leaders forward, and the professional organizer is supposed to sort of stay off stage. But when Barack leaves Chicago for Harvard Law School in 1988, it's with a very explicit plan that this is the first step towards an electoral career.
It was transformative in a number of ways, really. You say immersed in the black community for the first time. That had to transform him as well. Did you have many from the African American community come forward and give their views throughout this book?
Oh.
And they welcomed you on this?
Oh, yes. I mean, all told in this book, there are over 1,000 interviews that I myself did. And the people who worked with Barack down on the far South Side in those years are a wonderful set of people. 90% of them are still with us. A few have passed away since I first spoke to them 7 or 8 years ago. It was congregation-based organizing. The initial congregations were Roman Catholic. The steel industry on the southeast side was coming apart, collapsing very quickly. It's a very challenging circumstance. When Barack comes back to Chicago after law school in 1991, starts very slowly building a political career. He's working in a small progressive law firm in downtown Chicago. Starts teaching race and the law at the University of Chicago Law School. He's building this multi-part career before getting himself to Springfield in 1997 as a rookie state senator.
Well, some were not happy with him leaving the community and going out into the world that maybe was not theirs. And he was going into one certainly a little bit alien, was he not? Because we're an antiquarian bookshop, we're also able to have, I guess I'm going to be behind this, unless you can move the camera over here, a signed lawn sign. You don't see those very often. This opens up at the bottom here.
Oh, to
like
slip
this.
into the, yes.
And you don't see lawn signs like this, especially for the Senate, because people didn't know whom he was going to be, and so not many kept this. But here's one that we just got in our stock, and so this was a transformative time going down there. And what I want to ask you is not only what was the transformation that occurred there for him in a couple of ways. One is just being in an African American, even down there in central Illinois, is different. But also, we've always said here that that central Illinois really is a crossroads of every political stripe. And Lincoln learned his craft because know-nothings, Democrats, Whigs, you name it, they were all in the area. He learned from them. How about Obama? Was Central Illinois still that crossroads for him where he learned what he needed to know about all aspects to be maybe the compromiser he would have liked to have been?
Right. It's a great subject. Emil Jones Jr., the state senator, now former state senator, who was the Democratic leader down in Springfield, Emil said to me, and it's a wonderful, wonderful quote, that when he first went to the state legislature, he discovered that outside Chicago, there's this place called Illinois.
There's a big sign over here right near Orleans and Ontario that's had that up for a long time.
Okay.
As a way to get people down there.
And when Barack first gets to Springfield in early 1997, he is never sitting at the black table in the cafeteria, to use a common phrase in academia. He very purposely reaches out and establishes close social friendships with a trio of moderate to conservative white Democratic senators from outside Chicagoland. Denny Jacobs from Quad Cities, Larry Walsh from Joliet, Will County, and Terry Link from Waukegan, Lake County. Barack also, the first 6 years he's in Springfield, is working in a Republican-controlled chamber, and not just Republican, but very right-wing. Pate Phillip from DuPage County. And Barack very successfully works with very conservative Republicans, Dave Severson from Rockford, Steve Rauschenberger, Kirk Dillard, also from DuPage, and manages to get significant legislation, kid care, health coverage for children from poor families, even in a very conservative Republican environment that's opposed to entitlement programs. Barack, thanks to being really outgoing with Republicans, with conservative Democrats, has a quite successful track record in a very difficult situation.
Well, then what happened? If conservatives here in Illinois could team up with him, why did this not translate to the national scene? Although conservatives there may have been different than the conservatives here.
A Pate Phillip or a Dave Severson is more conservative than a Mitch McConnell or a John Boehner.
But are they more flexible for compromise?
Not necessarily. But I think Barack, when he was here in Illinois, even when he's running for the U.S. Senate in 2003, 2004, is a more bipartisan figure than he ended up as president. Now, part of that, a large part of that, I think many people would say, is that if you make the choice to have a Rahm Emanuel as your White House chief of staff, you have someone as partisan as David Axelrod. When Barack was down in Springfield,
Aren't they supposed to be a bit partisan? Aren't they for him? Aren't they help make him?
but the climate in Washington back in 2009, 2010 required the sort of social outreach across the aisle, which Barack did successfully pursue in Springfield. But it was 18 months, and this is, New York Times, Washington Post reporting back then early in the presidency. It's 18 months before Barack first invites Mitch McConnell to come have a one-on-one conversation at the White House. That's not the way Barack was in Springfield, quite simply.
I can't say why that was. I lived through it just as you did. And they have also said that they're sorry that they maybe had not reached out a bit more. I got to admit, my initial feeling on that is, whom are you going to work with?
Right.
When the Tea Party was ready to let the economy of America go down the drain for whatever their principle was. So they said from day one, we're not going to work with him. We're going to stop him. So here we're saying we're criticizing Obama for not reaching out. What about the other side?
But this is a book that is sort of 97% about Obama before he starts running for the presidency. The epilogue of this book really addresses the presidential campaign and the presidency primarily only through the lens of biographical issues from Barack's earlier life. Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Bill Ayers, that became controversial issues during the campaign, during the presidency.
Are you going to continue this and write on into that? So
No.
maybe write that a little bit?
No. I think this book is phenomenally original, comprehensive, authoritative.
Positively for the
For the
area.
period up through 2006.
Right.
But we are probably several decades away from somebody being able to do something this original on the presidency itself.
That's probably true. It is true, actually. The first biography of Obama was David Remnick's The Bridge. And you write that the book was criticized for not explaining how this rootless outsider acquired the self-confidence that fueled his ascent in national politics. Can you explain that self-confidence?
The 3 years in Roseland and in Hyde Park, 85 to 88, were an annealing experience for Barack. He comes to realize that he does have this strength, that he does have these internal resources, that he has this special, unique ability to not only work in an African American context, but to very easily, very successfully work outside the black community as well. So by the time he gets to Harvard, age 27, he has a strength, an intensity of self-confidence that really leads him to think that he has this destiny that will allow him to not only succeed in politics, but to reach the presidency. The two women he's closest to during those years, both, they didn't know each other, both heard him say that. Their memories are almost word for word identical. Barack says the same thing to his wife, Michelle. They marry in 1992. And to Michelle's brother, Craig, Barack's brother-in-law. And even back during the campaign, Craig Robinson told the story of Barack mentioning the presidency to him in the early 90s, and Craig's response was, "President? president of what? And it's, I think, likewise, it's been publicly known for some time that, all throughout the 1990s, up till that 2004 U.S. Senate race, Michelle Obama was extremely doubtful and dubious about these political aspirations. And only come 2004 does she really become an active participant in Barack's political career.
But he had that confidence, as you said, which grew, and he felt that he could go to the top. I think any politician who becomes a politician says, hey, why can't I get to the top? And Lincoln certainly did that. He came out of nowhere, and he was able to do it. I want to get to something on that. But first, Virginia in Blue Springs, Missouri. Thank you, Virginia, for reaching out. Her question, was Barack associated with St. Sabina Church in Chicago and Reverend Flager?
Yes. I think of the 1,000+ people I spoke with working on this book, I think Father Mike is without question the most courageous person I've met. My own deep personal grounding in the life of Martin Luther King makes me love Mike Flager and what he's done. Now, both St. Sabina, Father Flager's church, and Trinity United Church of Christ, Reverend Jeremiah Wright's church, were geographically outside the borders of the neighborhood in which Barack's community group was working back during those years. But Barack reached out and became close to Father Mike and to Jeremiah in 87, 88. And once Barack is down in Springfield as a state senator, he continues to work closely with Father Mike because St. Sabina was and is an extremely active church down in that Auburn-Gresham community. And St. Sabina, like Trinity, when Jeremiah Wright was pastor, had an amazingly positive impact on the South Side. And no one, whether it's Jeremiah, whether it's Mike Flager, should be judged by history based on the 2 or 3 stupidest things that they've happened to say in their lives.
Yeah, we all do that, don't we? My question is going to be, after I read something here, is what did you think about Obama embracing our man, Abraham Lincoln? I was asked a gazillion times, when reporters and others, about the connection of them. I even had a list that I made, each brought up by a strong woman other than his mother. Articulate and expressive, organized minds that think deeply about issues, boiled down issues to their kernels, and able to explain it to others. Careful in their thought processes and speaking from legal training. Listens to others, but then makes up own mind and sticks to it. Mediators, I think, understand and use media and the latest technology well. Humble beginnings, but connected with the people. Ambitious, which is fine with me for a politician. Living in that diverse area where they both grew up politically in the middle of the state. Each had an innate sense of timing for getting into the presidency. So what do you think about his embrace of that? Okay, Obama is not Lincoln, but Lincoln wasn't Lincoln for a long time either. And neither of them maybe arguably were really ready, if anyone is, except maybe for LBJ, for the presidency. What do you think of his embrace of our man?
When Barack announces for the presidency in 2007, it's a very calculated choice to do it at the old state capitol down in Springfield, to associate himself with Lincoln. And I think in significant part to emphasize that he's from Illinois, not from Chicago. Because Illinois, in part thanks to Lincoln, Illinois has a somewhat better political reputation, it's without question the case, than the city of Chicago. But Barack was someone who, as a young man, even throughout the 1990s, he's basically reading fiction. Barack is not someone who, at all immersed himself in the, biographical literature on Abe Lincoln. So in all frankness, I view that embrace as very much a political strategy.
All right. Well, that's good too. That's not a bad thing, I suppose. I'm hanging on to Lincoln's coattails for dear life as well in commerce, so I can understand that. This is kind of a little off, but something came by, and I said, wow, Bob Schaefer, you say in
Oh,
your
yes.
book, said that Obama's was the most manipulative and secretive administration. So I said, had he forgotten Martin Van Buren, or John Adams, or Richard Nixon, or Edith Wilson even? Had he forgotten all these? Doesn't it come with the territory?
I don't think Bob Schieffer was back there covering the Van Buren White House.
Open the book.
But
We'll find out.
I think most of the White House press corps, not just Bob Schieffer, ended up very troubled by the extent to which the Obama presidency and the Obama Justice Department was more aggressive in prosecuting leakers and investigating journalists, than any prior.
And Richard Nixon?
Yeah, more so than Nixon.
Then on this, and talking about what you did with Lincoln, some have called one of Lincoln's close friends, after the death, said that Lincoln was cunning. And I'm wondering if he was cunning or was he calculating? And there's a difference. And the same thing with Obama. Which way do you see him?
I think calculating is a perfectly appropriate word to describe Barack. Compartmentalization is a word I have heard again and again from people with whom I've spoken, who've known Barack over the years. The Alinsky community organizing tradition that Barack was trained in from 85 to 88 told its organizers that you should practice an absolute separation between your professional workday life and your personal life. And that came very easily to Barack. And Barack was always, with his early girlfriends and with his daughters in the White House, very appropriately, always tried to create a sort of Chinese wall between personal and family life and political life.
Well, and even within each of those compartments, there are compartments. And that's something that brings me to Sheila Miyoshi Yeager. You put a great deal of faith into her. I'm a son of a psychoanalyst, and people are very complex, and they have many different motives to do any one thing that we see, especially something like marriage. And one calculates marriage to some extent. It's not all from the heart. If it was, that would be great, but it's not all that. We all calculate our lives and what we intend to be. How far, and I'm not sure you can answer this either, but how far can we go with these sources who are so close to Obama, who knew them, like Sheila, very close, and even Lamon with Lincoln said he didn't really know Lincoln, and every one of his friends said the same thing. They all got around him. They all had him surrounded. And I'm wondering how much of that happens here, how much of a surrounding there are. Who really is Obama? Could they really get to him? Do we know without putting him on the couch, and them as well?
Right.
What are their motives, or even unconscious motives?
Barack and Sheila Yeager lived together from 1986 till 1988. They were remained involved from 86 to 1991. In the present day, Professor Yeager is one of the top U.S. experts on Korea. She's written very well-regarded scholarly books. So she's not just a former girlfriend. She herself is a scholar and a historian. So she understands the tasks of history. Now, when Barack and Sheila are talking about getting married early in their relationship, Christmas 1986, Sheila takes Barack to California to meet her parents. And her parents' best friend, Mike Dees, is invited there on purpose to meet the prospective son-in-law. And so we have a completely independent witness to these marriage discussions whose account of what happened matches up 100% with Sheila's. So there's no question that this marriage conversation between Barack and Sheila was extremely serious. Sheila's parents did not want her to marry Barack because they thought someone who was working as a community organizer was not very good, career prospects. And so
My parents wondered about that when I entered the book world.
so it's one of the most important relationships in Barack Obama's entire life. And in the present day world, to me, it's remarkable that someone could spend 8 years as president of the United States, and given the degree of journalistic interest in Barack, that up until now, prior to me, no one had made the effort to find out, well, who was this woman whom he lived with for years?
And of course, and one's own reality may transcend the truth is something I always think about when I read anything about from Herndon's informants to your informants. I have to think the same thing. I have two things quickly because we're near the end. And so very briefly,
Sure.
And there's so much in this book that you just have to get into. That's all there is to it. We can't take 40 minutes and give you everything. And there's a lot we've left out here, which I'd love to continue on with. You're going to have to do your work and get into it. But very briefly, we have 2 copies of later editions of his books that he wrote. Each of these, actually, I'm going to take one of these out of the picture for a second, are also signed by him, which is nice. So a good collectible that we just got in with that sign. Very briefly, how do you see Barack showing himself, informing us through these of whom he is, or at least whom he wants us to believe?
Exactly. Dreams from My Father, the earliest of those 2 books, published in 1995, is a very incomplete, often misleading account of Barack's earlier life. Barack portrays himself in that as a very unhappy, angry young man, calls himself a thug at one point. Malarkey. No one, I've spoke with scores and scores of people who knew him during those years. None of his friends, teachers, supportive adults who knew him during those years, they all think he was a happy, smiling, effervescent young man.
Until he went to a bell tower with a high-powered rifle, yes?
But Barack is trying to present a persona in that first book. And I call it, my verdict on that first book is that it's a work of historical fiction. Carlos Lozada, in his long Washington Post review, characterizes that verdict as persuasive. And I think that's the task of a professional historian, is to look back, evaluate the sources, evaluate all the people who were there, and render a historical judgment.
Yeah, and that's something I want from historians and from their books. I do want judgments because you people know more than we do. We'll have to make our own decisions on many other books, but nonetheless, that's what we look for. I just want to end this on a positive note. Is there any positive things that you can say about Obama that maybe doesn't really boil up in this particular work? Is there something positive that you see? And I'm sure you, of course, like me, as I said, disappointed, and he changed, and you probably had a different idea going into the book than you did going out. So what positive things did you find from him?
The positive legacy of Barack's presidency on the domestic side can be summed up in 4 words. Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, both of whom are already superb justices. And whatever happens with health care policy, tax policy, the federal budget, Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan will both still be there 25 years from now. That is, to me, the number one element of the Obama legacy. Similarly, here we are, 2017. No matter what happens with the Trump presidency, the Trump legacy already is right there. Neil Gorsuch. Yep. And Justice Gorsuch, again, will still be there probably 30, 35 years from now, no matter what happens with the Trump presidency.
Yeah, it's true. Well, David, thank you so much. We're at the end of our time today.